Beneath the warm Mediterranean sun of Crete, where olive groves whisper in the afternoon breeze and wild herbs scent the mountain air, lay sleeping the remnants of a civilization so advanced, so beautiful, that when it was first uncovered, scholars could hardly believe what they were seeing. Here, in this island paradise floating like a jewel in the Aegean Sea, ancient stones held secrets that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the Bronze Age world. The earth itself seemed to breathe with hidden stories. Local shepherds had known for generations that something lay beneath their feet. Fragments of painted pottery surfaced after heavy rains. Carved stones emerged from eroded hillsides. And sometimes, in the quiet moments of dawn or dusk, the land itself seemed to whisper of forgotten glories. They spoke of palaces built by ancient kings, of treasures buried in the soil, of a time when their island was the center of a world we can barely imagine. Before we journey back to this ancient world together, take a moment to get comfortable. Find your favorite position, perhaps adjust your pillow, and let yourself settle in. I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And how is your day? Whatever brought you here, I'm glad you've chosen to spend this peaceful time exploring history with me. If you find yourself drawn to stories like this, tales of lost civilizations and ancient mysteries told in a way that lets your mind gently wander, I'd be grateful if you'd consider giving this video a quiet like, and perhaps subscribing for more journeys through time. It truly helps these stories reach others who, like you, find comfort in the whispers of the past. Now, let's begin our gentle exploration into one of history's most beautiful mysteries. The year was 1900, and a man named Arthur Evans walked across a hillside near Heracleion, drawn by stories local people had been telling for generations about the palace of the ancient kings. The earth here felt different somehow, softer, more yielding, as if it held secrets just waiting to be gently coaxed into the light. Evans was no ordinary treasure hunter, but a scholar, with patient eyes and gentle hands, someone who understood that the past reveals itself only to those who approach it with reverence. The morning he began his excavations, the Mediterranean sun cast long shadows across the rolling landscape. Olive trees, some of them ancient beyond memory. The air carried the scent of wild thyme and rosemary, the distant salt tang of the sea, and something else, something that seemed to speak of ages long past, of civilizations that had once flourished under this same eternal sky. Evans began his work carefully, methodically, with the patience of someone who understood that the earth gives up its secrets reluctantly. Each shovelful of soil was examined, each fragment catalogued with the care of a jeweler handling precious stones. And indeed, what began to emerge from that Cretan hillside were treasures more valuable than any precious metal, fragments of a lost world that had been sleeping beneath the surface for nearly 4,000 years. First came pottery shards, painted with flowing organic designs that seemed to dance even in their broken state. Spirals that reminded one of nautilus shells, or unfurling ferns, flowers that bloomed eternally in clay, sea creatures that appeared to swim through ceramic oceans. These weren't crude Bronze Age artifacts, but sophisticated artworks that spoke of a culture with an eye for beauty that rivaled anything the classical world would later produce. Then came larger pieces, sections of walls decorated with the most exquisite frescoes. As Evans and his team carefully brushed away the accumulated dust of millennia, colours emerged that seemed to glow within a light. Blues as deep as the Aegean at midnight, reds like the sunset sky, yellows that captured the essence of Mediterranean sunshine. These weren't mere decorations, but windows into a world that valued beauty, not as luxury, but as necessity, as essential to life as bread or water. As the weeks turned to months, something magnificent began to emerge from its long slumber. This wasn't just any ancient site. This was a palace complex so vast, so intricate, that it seemed to sprawl like a peaceful city beneath the ground. Room after room revealed themselves, connected by corridors that curved and flowed like gentle streams, stairways that wound between levels with organic grace, courtyards that opened like flowers to the sky above. The architecture itself told a story of a people who understood harmony in ways we're still learning to appreciate. There were no harsh angles, no brutal impositions of human will upon natural forms. Instead, everything seemed to grow from the landscape itself, as if the builders had listened to the earth and allowed their structures to follow its suggestions. Columns tapered naturally like tree trunks, their forms suggesting growth rather than mere structural necessity. What Evans was uncovering defied everything archaeologists thought they knew about Bronze Age civilization. Here were multi-story buildings with sophisticated drainage systems, where rainwater was collected in carefully designed cisterns and channeled through networks of clay pipes with a precision that would impress modern engineers. There were storage rooms filled with massive jars, pithoi, that once held olive oil, wine, and grain, speaking of abundance and prosperity on a scale that seemed almost mythical. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with life. Frescoes depicted young people leaping gracefully over balls in what appeared to be a sacred dance, their movements captured with such skill that they seemed frozen in eternal motion, forever suspended in that moment between earth and sky. Dolphins played across painted seas, their forms so naturalistic yet so graceful that one could almost hear the splash of water. Women in elaborate gowns conversed in garden settings, their expressions serene and contemplative, their eyes holding secrets we can only guess at. As more of the palace emerged, Evans realized he had found something unprecedented in the ancient world. This was not a fortress built for conflict. There were no massive defensive walls towering into the sky, no weapons stores filled with instruments of destruction, no evidence of the militaristic mindset that characterized most Bronze Age civilizations. Instead, everything spoke of a people who lived in harmony with their environment and each other, who had somehow transcended the cycle of violence that seemed to define their age. The craftsmanship was extraordinary by any standard. Stone had been cut and fitted with precision that wouldn't look out of place in a modern building. Yet there was an organic quality to everything that spoke of human hands guided by aesthetic principles rather than mere technical skill. Stairways curved gracefully between levels, following natural contours rather than imposing geometric regularity. Courtyards invited gathering and contemplation, their proportions designed to make occupants feel welcomed rather than intimidated. Evans named this civilization Minoan, after the legendary king Minos of Greek mythology, the ruler who was said to have commanded the seas and demanded tribute from distant lands. But, as excavation continued, it became clear that these people were far older than the Greeks, far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined possible for their time. They had flourished when Egypt was still building its first pyramids, when Mesopotamian cities were just learning to work bronze, when most of Europe remained locked in the Stone Age. The palace at Knossos wasn't alone. Similar complexes began emerging across Crete, as archaeologists followed Evans's lead, at Phaistos with its mysterious disk covered in undecipherable symbols, at Malia with its sacred Knossos stone marked with mysterious depressions, at Sakros where the palace seemed to have been abandoned in haste, meals still on tables when disaster struck. Each one was unique in its details, yet all shared the same peaceful philosophy, the same celebration of beauty and nature, the same remarkable absence of fortifications or weapons. Who were these people who built such beautiful palaces? How did they live their daily lives in these remarkable structures? What did they believe that allowed them to create such peaceful prosperity? What language did they speak? What stories did they tell? What songs did they sing as they worked in their workshops and tended their gardens? And perhaps most mysteriously of all, where did they go? How does an entire civilization, one so advanced and sophisticated, simply vanish from history, like morning mist dissipating in the rising sun? Among the most intriguing discoveries were thousands of clay tablets covered in an unknown script that seemed to flow like water across their surfaces. Unlike the angular cuneiform of Mesopotamia or the rigid hieroglyphs of Egypt, this writing danced with organic grace. Its symbols suggesting plants and animals, and abstract concepts that seem to live and breathe on the clay. Evans called it Linear A, and despite decades of intensive study by brilliant linguists and codebreakers, it remains largely undeciphered. A written language that keeps its secrets, whispering just out of reach of our understanding. As night falls over modern Crete, and the ancient stones of Knossos rest quietly under starlight, we can close our eyes and imagine this remarkable civilization as it once was. Peaceful, prosperous, connected to the rhythms of the natural world in ways we're only beginning to understand. The Minoans had emerged from history's shadows, but their story was just beginning to unfold, and each chapter would prove more fascinating than the last. Imagine, if you will, awakening in a Minoan palace as the first golden light of dawn filters through stone-framed windows, painting the walls with patterns that shift and change like living frescoes. The air carries the scent of wild herbs from the hillsides, the distant salt of the sea, and closer at hand, the gentle fragrance of flowers that grow in carefully tended palace gardens. In the courtyards below, water flows gently through channels carved from stone, creating a soft, continuous murmur that seems to set the rhythm for the day ahead. This was a world where time moved differently, not rushed by the demands of survival or driven by the harsh necessities of warfare, but flowing like honey, sweet and unhurried. The Minoans lived in harmony with the natural cycles of their island home, their days unfolding with the peaceful predictability of the seasons, their lives structured by the gentle rhythms of cultivation and harvest, of trade winds and calm seas, of festivals that celebrated the abundance their peaceful way of life had created. Within the great palace complexes, life was organized in layers like the petals of a flower, each level serving its purpose while contributing to the beauty of the whole. At the center lived what we might call the royal family, though we know so little of their actual governance that they remain dreamlike figures, shadowy rulers, who seem to have led through prosperity rather than force, through the creation of beauty rather than the projection of power. The frescoes show us glimpses of these elite Minoans, and they are unlike the imperial portraits of other ancient civilizations. Here are women with elaborate ringlet hairstyles that must have taken hours to create, wearing layered gowns in vibrant blues and yellows that speak of sophisticated textile production and a love of colour that pervades their entire culture. Their eyes are outlined with kohl in the manner of Egyptian nobility, but their expressions are different. Serene, contemplative, suggesting inner lives rich with thoughts we can only imagine. The men appear with long dark hair and narrow waists, sometimes wearing only loincloths that show off bodies bronzed by the Mediterranean sun and muscled by lives that included physical activity as a form of art rather than merely labour. These weren't portraits of warriors or conquerors, but of people who seemed to celebrate the human form as part of the natural beauty they honoured in all things. Beyond the palace walls, the people of Crete lived lives connected intimately to the land and sea that sustained them. In workshops that lined the lower levels of the palaces, artisans worked with materials gathered from across their extensive trading networks. Gold from Egypt that they shaped into jewellery of incredible delicacy. Silver from Anatolia that became cups and vessels that caught candlelight like captured stars. Ivory from distant lands that was carved into combs and gaming pieces that spoke of leisure time and the celebration of play. The potter sat at his wheel, hands gentle on clay that would become vessels of extraordinary beauty. Some were decorated with octopi whose tentacles seemed to dance around curved surfaces, the creatures appearing so lifelike that one could almost see them moving through their ceramic seas. Others were adorned with flowers that bloomed eternally in their glazed gardens, lilies and irises and crocuses that never wilted, never faded, preserving the beauty of Cretan springs for all eternity. Each piece was not merely functional but a work of art in its own right, suggesting a culture that found sacred beauty in everyday objects, that refused to separate the practical from the aesthetic. A simple cup for drinking wine became a canvas for artistic expression, A storage jar for olive oil became an opportunity to celebrate the marine life that populated their coastal waters. This wasn't mere decoration, but a way of living that insisted beauty should be part of every moment, every action, every breath. In the olive groves that terraced the hillsides around the palaces, farmers tended trees, some of which may have been ancient, even in Minoan times. The olive was sacred to their culture, providing not just food and oil, but the economic foundation that supported their peaceful prosperity. The harvest was a community affair, entire families working together, as they had for generations, the silvery leaves catching the light like whispered prayers, the ripe fruit falling into baskets with sounds like gentle rain. The oil that flowed from the stone presses was liquid gold, valuable enough to trade across the Mediterranean, pure enough to burn in sacred lamps, nourishing enough to sustain bodies and flavour food that turned every meal into a celebration. The Minoans understood that abundance shared was abundance multiplied, and their olive oil found its way to tables from Egypt to Anatolia, carrying with it something of the peaceful spirit of the island that produced it. Perhaps most remarkably for the ancient world, Minoan society seems to have honoured women in ways that were extraordinary for their time. The frescoes show us women not as shadowy figures relegated to the background of men's lives, but as central participants in religious ceremonies, in palace administration, in the very heart of their civilization's cultural and spiritual life. The famous snake goddess figurines, small sculptures of women holding serpents aloft with calm, confident expressions, suggest female priestesses or deities at the center of religious practice. These aren't fearsome figures demanding sacrifice or inspiring terror, but serene ones connected to the natural world, to fertility and renewal, to the mysterious forces that bring abundance to the land and wisdom to the human heart. Women appear to have moved freely through palace spaces, participating in ceremonies that seem to celebrate rather than placate divine forces, engaging in what looks like animated conversation in garden settings that speak of intellectual equality as well as social freedom. Their clothing was elaborate and beautiful, with fitted bodices and flowing skirts that required sophisticated tailoring skills, suggesting not restriction, but celebration of feminine grace and power. The famous ball-leaping frescoes show young women participating alongside men in what appears to have been the most sacred and challenging of Minoan athletic ceremonies. These images are among the most captivating that survive from the ancient world, showing figures engaged in what archaeologists call bull leaping, though this wasn't the violent spectacle we might imagine from later cultures. Instead, it appears to have been a sacred dance, a ritual performance where acrobats would grasp the horns of a bull and vault gracefully over its broad back in movements that required incredible timing, strength, and courage. The bulls in these images don't appear enraged or threatening. They seem almost participants in the ceremony, their powerful forms painted with the same care and reverence as the human figures, suggesting a culture that saw strength not as something to dominate, but as something to dance with, to honour, to celebrate, as part of the divine order. The young athletes are painted with bodies of impossible grace, lean and muscled, moving with a fluidity that seems almost supernatural. Their faces show concentration but not fear, suggesting this was as much spiritual practice as physical achievement, a way of connecting human consciousness with the raw power of nature, of celebrating the harmony that was possible when courage met reverence, when skill danced with respect for the forces beyond human control. The great halls of Minoan palaces were designed for gathering, for celebration, for the sharing of abundance that characterized their culture. Archaeological evidence suggests elaborate feasting, with exotic foods brought from across the Mediterranean through their extensive trade networks. They enjoyed wine that flowed from decorated reita, ceremonial vessels often shaped like animals or sea creatures, each one a work of art that transformed the simple act of drinking into a form of communion with the natural world. Imagine the soft glow of oil lamps reflecting off painted walls, their light dancing across frescoes of dolphins and flowers and graceful human figures, engaged in eternal celebration. Picture the gentle murmur of conversation, in a language we can no longer understand, words flowing like music in the warm air. Listen to the clink of ceramic cups touched together in toasts to prosperity, to friendship, to the continuing abundance of their peaceful civilization. Music would have filled these spaces, lyres with strings that sang of love and adventure, flutes that mimicked the songs of birds, perhaps drums keeping rhythm like a heartbeat, connecting the revelers to something larger than themselves. The Minoans seem to have understood celebration not as excess or escape, but as a form of gratitude, thanksgiving for the bounty of their island, for the safety of their trade expeditions, for the continuing prosperity that allowed them to create beauty rather than weapons, art rather than fortifications. In the quieter corners of palace life, children learn the ways of their ancestors, and the evidence suggests that boys and girls together received the kind of education that would later be reserved for elite males in other cultures. They learned to read the mysterious linear A script in rooms where afternoon light slanted through windows, their small fingers tracing symbols on practice tablets, while teachers spoke softly of laws and inventories, and perhaps poems, whose meaning is now lost to us forever. They would have learned to swim in the palace pools that were engineering marvels in their own right. Sophisticated water management systems that collected rainwater and provided recreational spaces that spoke of a culture wealthy enough to dedicate precious resources to pleasure and health. They learned to identify the medicinal herbs that grew wild on the mountain slopes, to understand the phases of the moon that guided both agriculture and navigation, to read the subtle signs that predicted weather changes and seasonal shifts. Most importantly, they learned to see beauty in the curve of a dolphin breaking the surface of the harbour, in the spiral of a nautilus shell washed up on the beach, in the way morning light played across the painted walls of their homes. This wasn't aesthetic education as we might understand it, but a way of being in the world that made every moment an opportunity for wonder, every sight a potential source of joy. In workshops that hummed with quiet activity, master craftsmen passed down skills that had been refined over generations, techniques that would have been closely guarded secrets in other cultures, but seem to have been shared freely within the Minoan community. The metalworker who created delicate gold jewellery learned to see in precious metals not just material wealth, but possibilities for creating beauty that could last forever, ornaments that would carry something of their creator's vision into the distant future. Seal makers carved tiny gemstones with images so precise, so detailed, that modern magnification reveals work of almost impossible delicacy. Lions and griffins, bulls and dolphins, human figures engaged in ritual activities, all compressed into spaces no larger than a fingernail, each one unique, suggesting a culture that valued individual artistic expression even within the constraints of traditional forms and purposes. The fresco painters worked with pigments that have retained their vibrancy for nearly 4,000 years, their techniques so advanced that we're still learning how they achieved certain effects. They painted not just decoration, but windows into their world. Gardens where saffron flowers bloomed in eternal spring, seas where dolphins played in choreographed formations, ceremonies where humans and nature came together in sacred harmony. These artists worked in teams, senior painters teaching apprentices not just technical skills, but ways of seeing, ways of understanding the relationship between art and life that made their work feel alive even today. They knew which pigments would fade and which would endure, how to layer colours to create depth and luminosity, how to capture movement in static images so convincingly that their painted figures seem ready to step off the walls. As evening approached and the last light faded from the Aegean, the great palaces of Crete would grow quiet, but not empty of activity. In the royal quarters, oil lamps cast gentle shadows on walls painted with scenes of abundance and beauty, their light flickering in rhythms that must have felt like the breathing of the palace itself. The sound of water continued its gentle murmur through the sophisticated drainage systems, a constant reminder of the engineering skill that made comfortable life possible. Perhaps a priestess made offerings in a small shrine, her prayers rising like incense toward deities we can no longer name, but whose presence seems to permeate every aspect of Minoan culture. Perhaps children listened to stories told by elders, tales of sea voyages to distant lands, of gods who lived in sacred caves, of heroes who danced with bulls and swam with dolphins. Stories that carried the wisdom and values of their civilization from one generation to the next. This was daily life in Minoan Crete, not the harsh struggle for survival we might expect from Bronze Age civilization, but something approaching an ancient paradise, where art and nature, work and celebration, the sacred and the everyday, flowed together like streams converging toward the sea. It was a way of living that seemed to prove that human beings could create something better than mere survival, that prosperity shared was prosperity multiplied, that beauty cultivated was beauty that enriched every aspect of existence. In the gentle shadows of Minoan palaces, art was never mere decoration, never simply ornamental addition to practical structures. Every image painted on these ancient walls whispered of beliefs so profound, so connected to the natural world, that they seem to breathe with spiritual life even today, nearly 4 millennia after the hands that created them returned to dust. The Minoans spoke through their art in ways that transcend the barriers of time and language, leaving us messages of beauty that still stir something deep within the soul, still call to us, across the centuries, with their vision of what human life might become when guided by reverence rather than conquest. Walk through the reconstructed halls of Knossos in your mind's eye, and you'll begin to understand what I mean. Here, dolphins leap eternally through painted seas of the deepest blue, their forms so graceful, so alive, that you might expect them to splash beyond the confines of their plaster ocean and continue their dance in the Mediterranean waters that still lap at Crete's shores. These aren't simply pretty pictures created to please the eye. They're expressions of a people who saw the sacred in every creature that shared their Mediterranean world, who understood that the divine could be encountered not in distant temples, but in the play of light on water, the grace of animals in motion, the eternal dance of life itself. At the heart of Minoan spirituality appears to have been reverence for the feminine divine, a theological tradition that saw in the female form not weakness to be protected or controlled, but power to be celebrated and honoured. The famous snake goddess figurines, small ceramic sculptures of women holding serpents with expressions of calm confidence, suggest a religious tradition centered on female deities who embodied the life-giving forces of nature, the mysterious powers that make seeds sprout and flowers bloom, that guide the moon through its phases and the seasons through their eternal cycle. These goddess figures don't inspire fear or demand submission in the manner of later patriarchal deities. Instead, they radiate a serene power, arms outstretched as if embracing the world, serpents coiled gently around their forms like living jewelry that speaks of their connection to the earth's deeper mysteries. The serpents themselves weren't symbols of danger or evil as they would become in later cultures, but of renewal and transformation, creatures who shed their skins and emerged reborn, connecting the goddess to cycles of death and regeneration that governed all life, from the daily setting and rising of the sun to the annual death and rebirth of vegetation. Imagine priestesses in flowing robes moving through sacred groves where ancient trees whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. Their rituals synchronized with the phases of the moon, with the flowering of plants, with the migration of birds that connected their island to distant lands. Their ceremonies wouldn't have been somber affairs designed to appease angry gods, but celebrations, joyful acknowledgements of the abundance that surrounded them, grateful recognition of their place in the larger web of life that sustained all creatures. High in the mountains of Crete, the Minoans built sanctuaries that seemed to touch the sky itself, sacred spaces that weren't grand temples demanding awe through size or intimidation through architectural weight, but intimate places, carved into cliff tops and nestled in sacred caves, locations where the boundary between earth and heaven grew thin, where mortals might come closest to touching the divine mysteries that governed their world. In these high places, archaeologists have found delicate bronze figurines, tiny human forms with arms raised in what appears to be prayer or ecstasy, their faces turned upward toward the sky, in expressions of rapture that speak of direct communion with divine forces. Some are so small they fit in the palm of your hand, yet each is crafted with exquisite care, every detail precisely rendered, suggesting that every offering, no matter how humble, was considered precious by those who made it and those who received it. The caves held special significance in Minoan religious practice, and it's not difficult to understand why. Deep within the earth, where darkness and silence reigned, where the normal world of sunlight and human activity seemed impossibly distant, the Minoans left pottery vessels filled with offerings. Honey that spoke of sweetness and abundance, oil that burned with sacred light, grain that represented the staff of life itself. These underground chambers may have been seen as wombs of the earth goddess, places where life gestated before emerging into the light, where the seeds of all existence were nurtured by divine forces. Perhaps nowhere is Minoan spirituality more beautifully expressed than in their garden frescoes, painted sanctuaries that transform architectural spaces into visions of paradise. The walls of Knossos bloom with paintings of lilies, irises and crocuses that seem to sway in an eternal breeze, their petals so perfectly rendered that one can almost smell their fragrance, so naturally positioned that they seem to have grown from the walls themselves rather than being painted upon them. These aren't botanical illustrations created for scientific purposes, but visions of paradise. Gardens where flowers never fade, where spring exists in perpetual renewal, where the beauty that graces our world for only brief moments is preserved in eternal perfection. The artists who created these masterpieces weren't simply recording what they saw in the natural world. They were expressing their understanding of what the natural world revealed about the divine order that sustained all existence. The famous bluebird fresco shows hoopoes and swallows dancing among flowering branches, their forms so naturalistic yet so graceful that they seem suspended between reality and dream, captured in a moment of pure joy that speaks of the artist's deep appreciation for the wonder of flight, the miracle of life in motion. These creatures move with a freedom that seems to embody the Minoan understanding of what life could be when lived in harmony with natural law, rather than in opposition to it. Even the colour choices in Minoan religious art speak of spiritual meaning and sacred purpose. The blues that dominate many of their most important frescoes were created from costly lapis lazuli, brought from Afghanistan through trading networks that spanned half the known world, suggesting these images were considered precious beyond measure, worth the enormous expense of importing rare pigments from distant lands. The reds came from cinnabar, the yellows from orpiment, minerals that caught and held light as if preserving sunshine itself within the stone, creating colours that would glow with inner radiance for millennia. Return with me to those extraordinary bull-leaping frescoes, but see them now through spiritual eyes, understanding them not as mere entertainment or athletic display, but as sacred performance, a dance between human consciousness and the raw power of nature that required not just physical courage, but spiritual preparation, not just athletic skill, but religious understanding. The bulls painted on these walls move with dignity and grace, their forms powerful yet gentle, suggesting creatures who participated willingly in this cosmic dance, rather than being forced into submission by human domination. They represent not enemies to be conquered, but partners in a ritual that celebrates the harmony between human skill and natural strength, between the conscious will of mortals and the unconscious power of the forces that sustain all life. Watch the painted figures move in your imagination, the moment of approach when the athlete prepares to test their courage against power beyond their control, the graceful grasp of horns that requires perfect timing and absolute trust, the somersault over the broad back that demands complete surrender to forces larger than the individual will, the gentle landing that speaks of harmony achieved, balance restored, the eternal dance between human consciousness and natural power completed in perfect grace. Each movement flows into the next like a prayer made visible, a meditation on balance and trust, and the delicate relationship between courage and reverence that characterized the Minoan approach to life itself. This wasn't sport as we understand it. competition designed to establish dominance, but sacred theatre that expressed their understanding of how human beings might live in right relationship with the powers that surrounded them. Throughout Minoan art, certain symbols appear again and again, like words in a sacred language we're only beginning to understand. Recurring motifs that carry meanings deeper than their surface appearances suggest. The double axe, or labrys, appears on palace walls and sacred objects not as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of divine power, perhaps representing the goddess's ability to both create and transform, to bring forth life, and to guide its passage through the cycles of growth and decay that govern all existence. Spirals dance across pottery and frescoes in endless variations, some tight and contained like Nautilus shells, others flowing outward like unfurling ferns, or the arms of galaxies spinning through cosmic space. These weren't mere decorative elements, but symbols of life's journey, of the eternal cycles that governed seasons and tides, and the passage of souls through the various stages of existence, from birth through maturity to death and renewal. The sacred horns, stylized bull's horns carved in stone, crowned many Minoan buildings, marking these structures as holy spaces dedicated to purposes beyond mere human convenience. These horns of consecration pointed toward the sky like prayers made solid, connecting earth to heaven in elegant curves of carved limestone that speak of a people who understood architecture as a form of worship, building as a way of participating in the sacred order that governs the cosmos. The women depicted in Minoan religious art move with a grace that suggests deep spiritual training, their elaborate costumes speaking not of vanity or social pretension, but of sacred purpose. Their layered skirts, fitted bodices, and hair arranged in complex styles weren't fashion statements, but ritual garments, each element carrying meanings that connected the wearer to divine forces, each detail chosen for its spiritual significance, rather than its aesthetic appeal alone. In the famous saffron gatherer fresco, you see a figure, perhaps a young priestess, collecting the precious stigma of crocus flowers with movements that radiate quiet devotion. This scene captures something essential about Minoan religious practice, the understanding that the sacred could be encountered not just in grand ceremonies, but in the careful attention to natural processes, the gentle gathering of earth's gifts, with hands that honoured both the giver and the gift. Imagine these priestesses moving through dawn ceremonies, their voices rising in hymns whose melodies are lost to us, but whose spiritual power seems to echo still in the painted halls where they once worshipped. Their hands would have woven sacred gestures that connected them to divine forces, their movements choreographed not for human audiences, but for the gods and goddesses whose presence they invoked through ritual action. Their ceremonies would have been beautiful rather than fearsome, celebrations of life rather than appeasements of wrathful deities. The Minoan understanding of the divine seems to have been fundamentally different from the theological traditions that would later dominate the Mediterranean world. Where other cultures saw gods who demanded sacrifice and submission, the Minoans apparently encountered deities who invited participation and celebration, who revealed themselves through beauty rather than terror, through abundance rather than scarcity. For the Minoans, all of Crete was a sacred landscape, every mountain holding caves where goddesses might dwell, every grove of trees potentially sheltering sacred springs, every beach offering treasures from the sea that connected their island to the larger world. The island itself was a temple, with the palaces serving as its altars, and the sea as its protective boundary, its waves like the breathing of some vast divine presence that sustained all life. They saw divinity in the dolphins that played in their harbours, recognizing in these intelligent creatures a kind of wisdom that complemented human understanding, a joyful approach to existence that seemed to embody their own cultural values. They found the sacred in the wild goats that leaped among their cliffs, seeing in their sure-footed confidence a model for how one might navigate life's challenging passages. They honoured the eagles that soared above their mountains, understanding in their mastery of wind and height a freedom that the human spirit might aspire to achieve. This wasn't primitive animism that confused natural phenomena with spiritual realities, but sophisticated theology, an understanding that the divine permeated all existence, that every creature and plant and stone participated in a cosmic harmony that human beings could learn to recognize and celebrate, that the sacred wasn't confined to special places or particular times, but was available in every moment to those who knew how to see. Rather than depicting distant, otherworldly gods who demanded worship from afar, they painted the sacred as it appeared in daily life. In gardens where flowers bloomed, in seas where dolphins played, in the grace of young bodies in motion, in the eternal dance of life that surrounded them on every side, and invited them to participate through reverence and celebration, rather than fear and submission. Despite all we can read in their beautiful art, despite the windows their frescoes and sculptures provide into their spiritual world, the deepest mysteries of Minoan religion remain locked away like treasures in some inaccessible vault. We don't know the names of their gods and goddesses, can't pronounce the words of their prayers, can only guess at the melodies of their hymns and the meanings of their most sacred symbols. But perhaps this is as it should be. Perhaps the mystery itself is more powerful than any complete knowledge could ever be. Some truths are too large for words, too deep for explanation, too beautiful for analysis to capture without destroying. The beauty of Minoan religious art doesn't demand complete understanding to work its magic on the human heart. It invites contemplation, wonder, a sense of connection to something larger than ourselves that speaks to the deepest longings of the human spirit. In the quiet moments when you look at a Minoan fresco, when you see those eternal dolphins leaping through their timeless sea, when you contemplate the serene face of the snake goddess holding her mysterious serpents, their art becomes a bridge connecting our world to theirs, carrying you into a realm where beauty itself was worship, where every brushstroke was a prayer, where the act of creation was understood as participation in the divine work of bringing forth life and meaning from the raw materials of existence. This profound spiritual connection to their world, this understanding of beauty as a form of sacred practice, helped the Minoans build something else extraordinary, a network of trade and cultural exchange that stretched across the ancient Mediterranean like a web of golden threads, connecting distant peoples through the universal language of beauty and commerce, creating relationships that enriched everyone who participated in their peaceful vision of how different cultures might interact with mutual benefit and respect. Picture the harbour at Knossos, in the golden light of early morning, when the sea lies calm as polished glass, and the air carries the mingled scents of wild herbs from the mountains and salt spray from the gentle waves. Minoan ships rest at anchor like sleeping seabirds, their curved hulls reflecting the sky, their sails furled like winds waiting for the wind's caress to lift them toward distant horizons. These weren't vessels of conquest or instruments of dominance, but peaceful merchants ready to carry the treasures of Crete to foreign shores and return with wonders from across the Mediterranean world. The Minoans were perhaps history's first great maritime traders, their ships following routes that would become highways of civilization, pathways of exchange that connected not just markets but minds, not just economies but entire ways of understanding the world. But theirs was a different kind of commerce, not the aggressive expansion of later empires that sought to impose their will upon distant people, but a patient, respectful exchange that seemed to enrich all who participated in its gentle rhythms. Their vessels themselves were works of art that reflected the aesthetic principles governing every aspect of their culture. Painted on palace walls, we see ships with graceful lines that follow natural curves rather than harsh geometric angles, decorated prows that speak of pride in craftsmanship, and crews that look more like pilgrims or artists than merchants concerned only with profit. These boats carried not just goods but culture, ideas, and the Minoan vision of beauty to people who had never imagined such refinement was possible in the material world. The ships were built with the same attention to harmony and proportion that characterized Minoan architecture, their hulls curved like dolphins' bodies, designed to move through water, with grace rather than simply to carry maximum cargo. Their sails were woven with patterns that echoed the spirals and marine motifs found in palace frescoes, making each vessel a floating gallery that carried a Minoan artistic vision to distant ports. Imagine following these ancient trade routes in your mind, drifting on warm Mediterranean currents from island to island, port to port, feeling the gentle rhythm of waves beneath your hull, and the steady push of trade winds filling your painted sails. The Minoans understood the sea, not as a barrier to overcome through force or cunning, but as a pathway to connection, its currents and winds as natural as the beating of their own hearts, its moods and seasons as predictable as the cycles of planting and harvest that governed life on land. Northward, the ships sailed to the Greek mainland, where they established peaceful trading posts among people who would later become the Mycenaeans. These weren't fortified outposts designed to project power or extract tribute, but open communities where Minoan merchants could offer their wares and foreign traders could find welcome. They brought pottery of impossible delicacy, vessels so thin they seemed to glow when held to the light, decorated with marine motifs that brought the poetry of the sea to landlocked settlements. Their jewelry captured sunlight in gold and silver, creating ornaments that seemed to hold the very essence of Mediterranean radiance within their precious forms. Necklaces traced the curves of shells and flowers, earrings swayed like dancing dolphins, rings bore the spirals that connected their wearers to the eternal cycles that governed all life. These weren't merely valuable objects, but ambassadors of a way of seeing that found the sacred in beauty, and beauty in the natural world. Textiles dyed in colours that seemed borrowed from paradise itself, blues like the deep sea at noon, purples like morning shadows on mountain slopes, yellows like the heart of the sun, carried Minoan aesthetic vision to foreign courts and distant markets. The dyes themselves came from sources around the Mediterranean: muric shells that yielded royal purple, saffron flowers that produced golden yellow, plants and minerals that were transformed through careful craft into colours that had never been seen before. In return for these treasures, they received amber from the distant Baltic, that fossilized tree resin that sometimes contained ancient insects preserved for millions of years, connecting the Minoans to geological time depths that dwarfed human history. This amber reached them through networks of exchange that spanned half the known world, passed from trader to trader, through forests and across rivers, down mountain passes and along coastal routes, until it arrived in Crete to be carved by their craftsmen into beads and ornaments that seemed to glow with inner fire. Eastward, their ships voyaged to Cyprus for its copper, that essential metal that, when mixed with tin from distant lands, created the bronze that gave its name to their age. But the Minoans didn't simply extract what they needed from foreign sources. They formed relationships, partnerships that lasted for generations. Their reputation for fair dealing becoming legend among Mediterranean people who had grown accustomed to exploitation and tribute demands from other powerful civilizations. The copper mines of Cyprus were worked by local people who found in the Minoans not masters but partners, traders who paid fair prices for raw materials and shared the techniques that transformed base metals into objects of beauty and utility. Minoan metalworkers taught Cypriot craftsmen new methods of alloying and shaping, while learning in return about local sources of ore and traditional methods of extraction that had been refined over centuries. The archaeological record reads like a catalogue of ancient wonders, each artifact telling stories of cultural exchange and peaceful cooperation that spanned vast distances. In Minoan palaces, archaeologists have found ivory from African elephants, carved into combs and gaming pieces of extraordinary beauty that speak of leisure time and the celebration of craftsmanship for its own sake. The ivory would have travelled for months to reach Crete, carried along the Nile and across the sea, its journey protected by treaties and relationships that made such long-distance trade possible. There are ostrich eggs from the African interior, transformed by Minoan artists into decorated vessels that must have seemed miraculous to people who had never seen such enormous eggs. The shells were painted with marine motifs, dolphins and octopi and nautili, bringing the poetry of the Mediterranean to objects created by creatures of the desert, creating hybrid artworks that celebrated both the familiar and the exotic. Silver from Anatolia became delicate cups that caught and reflected candlelight like captured stars, their surfaces decorated with scenes of Minoan religious ceremonies or natural imagery that carried their cultural values far from home. Each cup was a messenger, carrying within its precious form something of the peaceful vision that characterized their civilization, the understanding that beauty shared was beauty multiplied. From Egypt came gold, but also something perhaps more precious, papyrus and the knowledge of writing systems that could preserve human thoughts across time and space. The Minoans adapted Egyptian hieroglyphs and other writing systems they encountered, creating their own linear ray script that allowed their culture to flourish with unprecedented sophistication, enabling the complex record-keeping that made their extensive trade networks possible. Lapis lazuli travelled from Afghanistan to Crete, crossing deserts and mountains, rivers and seas, passed from trader to trader like a sacred flame that must never be allowed to die. This precious stone was ground into the brilliant blue pigment that coloured their most sacred frescoes, connecting their religious art to sources of beauty that lay at the very edges of the known world. Think of that journey. Precious stone crossing the width of Asia, its value recognized by people who spoke different languages and worshipped different gods, but who all understood that such beauty was worth preserving and sharing. The Minoans understood that trade was more than mere commerce. It was a form of communication that transcended language barriers, a way of sharing not just goods but ideas, not just materials but ways of seeing and being that could enrich the lives of everyone who participated. Their exports weren't just products, but ambassadors of their culture, carriers of aesthetic and spiritual values that could transform the consciousness of those who encountered them. A Minoan cup found in an Egyptian tomb carried with it something of Crete's peaceful philosophy, its celebration of natural beauty, translated into ceramic form that could outlast the civilization that created it. The cup's marine motifs brought the poetry of the sea to people who lived along the Nile, while its graceful proportions spoke of aesthetic standards that valued harmony over mere functionality. Their pottery, discovered from Cyprus to the Levant, tells stories of cultural exchange that went far beyond simple commercial transactions. Marine motifs, octopi whose tentacles seemed to dance, dolphins whose forms captured the essence of joyful movement, natally whose spirals connected them to cosmic patterns, appeared on vessels destined for landlocked cities, carrying the wonder of the sea to people who had never seen an ocean. These weren't simply decorative choices made to appeal to foreign markets, but gifts of vision, ways of sharing the Minoan understanding of a world where art and nature danced together in eternal harmony. Each decorated pot was a window into their worldview, an invitation to see reality through eyes that found the sacred in everyday beauty, the divine in natural forms. In return, foreign influences enriched Minoan culture in ways that speak of openness rather than cultural imperialism. Egyptian lotus flowers bloomed alongside Cretan lilies in their frescoes, creating hybrid gardens that existed only in art but spoke of real relationships between distant people. Eastern textile patterns inspired new designs in their weaving, while Mesopotamian metalworking techniques were adapted and refined to create objects that were distinctively Minoan while acknowledging their debts to foreign traditions. This wasn't cultural conquest or absorption, but cultural conversation, a gentle dialogue conducted through beautiful objects that carried meanings across linguistic and geographical areas. The Minoans seemed to understand that their own culture was enriched rather than threatened by exposure to foreign ideas, that their artistic traditions grew stronger when they incorporated the best insights from other civilizations. Across the Mediterranean, Minoan trading posts became centers of cultural flowering, nodes in a network of peaceful exchange that lifted the prosperity and sophistication of entire regions. These weren't fortified outposts maintained by military force, but open communities where merchants from many lands could meet in safety, where different languages mixed and merged, where new ideas could emerge from the creative friction between diverse ways of understanding the world. Archaeological evidence suggests these settlements were planned with the same attention to beauty and comfort that characterized the great palaces of Crete. Streets curved naturally rather than following rigid geometric patterns. Buildings incorporated the sophisticated drainage systems that made Minoan architecture so advanced, and public spaces were designed to encourage gathering and cultural exchange, rather than to project power or inspire fear. In these peaceful enclaves, children born to parents from different cultures grew up speaking multiple languages, carrying knowledge between worlds like living bridges that connected distant civilizations. They served as translators not just of words but of ideas, helping merchants from various lands understand not just each other's prices but each other's values, not just their goods but their goals. The Minoans brought their architectural innovations to these distant shores, but adapted them to local conditions and preferences, rather than imposing uniform standards that ignored geographical and cultural differences. They shared their sophisticated understanding of water management, helping coastal cities develop systems that could support larger populations and more complex urban organization. They introduced their multi-story building techniques, but modified them to work with local materials and construction traditions. They left their mark, not through conquest or cultural domination, but through the simple power of better ways of living that improved life for everyone who adopted them. Their influence spread through example rather than coercion, through the attraction of prosperity shared rather than the fear of power imposed. Among their most valued trade goods was saffron, that golden spice worth more than its weight in precious metals, a treasure that connected the Minoans to agricultural cycles and trading relationships that spanned the entire Mediterranean world. The Minoans cultivated vast fields of crocus flowers, their purple blooms carpeting the hillsides each autumn like a cloth of royal purple stretched across the landscape. The harvest was a community celebration that brought together people from across the island, young and old, working together as families had for generations. Young people moved between the rows of flowers, their fingers quick and gentle, as they plucked the precious stigma, while singers kept rhythm and dancers moved between the workers, transforming labor into festival, work into worship of the abundance their island provided. This saffron traveled to Egypt, where it colored the linens of pharaohs and flavored the food offered to gods in temple ceremonies. It reached Mesopotamia, where it was used in sacred rituals that connected earthly rulers to divine powers. Everywhere it went, it carried something of Crete's golden light, its celebration of small beauties that made life precious rather than merely possible. The trade in saffron connected the Minoans to the agricultural rhythms of distant lands, teaching them to understand not just their own seasons, but the cycles that governed prosperity across the entire Mediterranean world. They learned to time their harvests with sailing seasons, to preserve their precious cargo for long voyages, to calculate the desires of markets they might never see, but whose prosperity became connected to their own through threads of golden spice. What made Minoan trade so successful wasn't aggressive expansion or superior military force, but patient relationship building that created networks of mutual benefit and genuine trust. Their merchants were welcome in ports across the Mediterranean because they came not as conquerors seeking tribute, but as partners, offering goods that enhanced rather than dominated local economies and cultures. This approach created a prosperity that was widely shared, lifting the fortunes of entire regions rather than concentrating wealth in the hands of a few powerful rulers. Minoan trading posts became centers of local economic growth, their presence attracting other merchants and creating markets that served everyone's interests rather than merely extracting wealth for distant masters. They pioneered what we might now call fair trade, relationships built on mutual benefit rather than exploitation, on respect for local traditions rather than cultural imperialism, on understanding that prosperity shared created more wealth than prosperity hoarded. Their success proved that commerce could be a form of friendship rather than a tool of domination, that different people could interact without violence when they found ways to benefit each other. The wealth this generated allowed Minoan civilization to flourish in ways that impressed visitors from across the ancient world. Their palaces grew more beautiful with each generation, their art more sophisticated, their society more complex and peaceful. Trade didn't just bring them material goods, it brought ideas, techniques, and perspectives that enriched their understanding of what human life might become when guided by principles of beauty and cooperation rather than fear and competition. For nearly 1,000 years, the Minoans maintained these peaceful trade networks, their ships following routes that became highways of civilization, carrying not just goods, but the radical idea that different people could interact without violence, that commerce could be a form of cultural exchange that enriched everyone who participated in its gentle rhythms. Their influence can be traced in the pottery styles that spread across the Mediterranean, in the architectural innovations that appeared in distant cities, in the peaceful resolution of conflicts that might have led to warfare in other times and places. The Minoan approach to trade created a more connected, more peaceful world, proving that prosperity and beauty were not limited resources that required conquest to obtain, but renewable gifts that multiplied when they were shared. Even their competitors respected them, acknowledging the superiority of their approach, even when they couldn't fully adopt it themselves. Egyptian tomb paintings show Minoan merchants bearing gifts to pharaohs, depicted not as subject people bringing tribute, but as honoured guests, offering tokens of friendship and respect. This speaks to a reputation built over centuries of honest dealing, of keeping promises even when circumstances made it difficult, of treating trade as a sacred trust that connected them to the divine forces that sustained all prosperity. But how did they coordinate these far-flung networks that connected so many distant shores? How did they keep the records that made such complex commerce possible, send the messages that maintained relationships across vast distances, preserve the knowledge that allowed their peaceful trading empire to function with such remarkable efficiency? The answer lies partly in their mysterious writing system, a script that has guarded its secrets for nearly 4,000 years, maintaining its silence despite the best efforts of brilliant scholars to unlock its meaning. In the quiet corners of Minoan palaces, scribes once sat in pools of golden afternoon light that slanted through stone windows, their bronze styluses moving gently across soft clay tablets, with the practiced grace of artists creating works that would outlast their creators. They were engaged in something extraordinary for the Bronze Age world, the creation of a written language that flowed like water across clay surfaces, with symbols that seemed to dance rather than merely convey information. Graceful forms that suggested the aesthetic principles governing every aspect of their culture. We call it Linear A, and it remains one of archaeology's most beautiful mysteries, a script that tantalizes us with its elegance while refusing to yield its meaning. Thousands of tablets covered with these flowing symbols have been found across Crete and on other Mediterranean islands where Minoan influence spread. Yet after more than a century of intensive study by linguists and cryptographers, we can read only fragments, understand only glimpses of what these ancient writers were trying to preserve for future generations. It's as if we've discovered a vast library filled with poetry written in an unknown tongue. We can see the beauty of the script, sense the importance of the words through their careful formation and frequent repetition, feel the weight of meaning in their patterns and variations. But the actual content floats just beyond our reach, like trying to remember the details of a half-forgotten dream that seemed profound upon waking, but dissolves when you try to capture it in conscious memory. Look at linear A symbols in your mind's eye, and you'll begin to understand what made this writing system so distinctive among the scripts of the ancient world. Unlike the rigid wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform that seemed to fight against the clay that received them, or the formal pictographs of Egyptian hieroglyphs that maintain their connection to the objects they originally represented, Linear A flows with organic grace that seems to emerge naturally from the material on which it was written. The symbols seem alive in a way that other ancient scripts do not. Some curved, like growing vines reaching towards sunlight. Others angular, like mountain peaks, cutting sharp profiles against the sky. All of them moving across the clay with the rhythm of natural speech, suggesting a language that valued sound in flow as much as meaning and precision. Each character has personality. individual presence that makes reading Linear A feel like encountering a crowd of distinctive individuals rather than processing abstract information. Each tablet tells a story we can only partially understand, like listening to a conversation in a room next door where individual words occasionally emerge from the murmur, but the overall meaning remains elusive. We can recognize numbers thanks to the universal language of mathematics that transcends cultural boundaries. Quantities of oil and grain and precious metals that speak of abundance and careful record keeping. We can identify some common words that appear frequently across many tablets, though their precise meanings remain tantalizingly unclear. But the full message, the complete thought these scribes were trying to preserve, slips away like water through our fingers, leaving us with fragments that suggest vast stores of knowledge we cannot access. Some tablets seem to be inventories, mundane lists of goods received or distributed, perhaps records of trade transactions that once seemed urgent but now speak to us only of the daily business that kept their civilization functioning. Others appear more ceremonial in their purpose, possibly religious texts or royal proclamations that were meant to endure beyond their immediate circumstances. The careful formation of symbols on these tablets suggests scribes who understood the sacred nature of their task, who knew they were preserving words that carried weight beyond their immediate practical application. A few contain sequences of symbols that feel almost like poetry when you look at them, their patterns suggesting rhythm and repetition that goes beyond mere record keeping, meanings that run deeper than simple information transfer. These may be the closest we can come to hearing Minoan voices directly, to understanding not just how they lived, but what they thought about their lives, what stories they told themselves about their place in the world. Imagine the young scribes learning their craft in palace schools, where afternoon light created perfect conditions for close work, their fingers growing strong from pressing styluses into yielding clay, their minds sharp from memorizing the hundreds of symbols that made up their written language. This wasn't merely technical training and a useful skill, but initiation into a sacred trust that connected them to the accumulated wisdom of their ancestors and the future generations who would inherit their knowledge. The training would have been rigorous but gentle, reflecting the aesthetic values that governed every aspect of the Minoan culture. Students learned not just to form symbols correctly, but to form them beautifully, understanding that the appearance of writing was as important as its content, that ugly handwriting was a kind of disrespect for the ideas being preserved, that grace in letter formation was a reflection of mental clarity and spiritual discipline. These scribes would have been among the most respected members of Minoan society, holders of knowledge that made complex civilization possible, masters of the mysterious art that could transform the spoken word into permanent form, could send messages across vast distances, could preserve wisdom beyond the span of human memory. They alone could record the treaties and agreements that held their peaceful trading empire together, could maintain the inventories that tracked wealth across generations, could preserve the religious formulas and historical narratives that gave meaning to their collective existence. In quiet scribal chambers lit by oil lamps where natural light faded, they worked with the patience of artists creating masterpieces, their shadows dancing on painted walls as they carefully formed each symbol. They knew that their words might be read by future generations, though they could never have imagined how distant those future readers would be, or how completely their language would be forgotten before modern archaeologists began the patient work of trying to resurrect meaning from silent clay. Some Linear A tablets were never meant to be permanent records, simply administrative documents, daily inventories, temporary notes, working papers that scribes expected to erase and reuse when their immediate purpose was fulfilled. But fire, the destroyer that ended many Minoan palaces, also became their preserver, baking these humble clay tablets into ceramic permanence that would outlast the civilization that created them. So we have shopping lists that were meant to last only days, now preserved for millennia, like accidentally immortal witnesses to the routine concerns of a vanished people. We have casual notes between administrators, urgent messages about shipments or ceremonies, fragments of a busy, literate society that conducted its daily business through written communication as naturally as we send emails or text messages. Yet, we also have tablets that feel more significant in their purpose. Text written with extra care, symbols formed with particular precision, documents that were clearly meant to endure beyond their immediate circumstances. These might be laws that governed their society, religious formulas that guided their spiritual practices, poems that celebrated their values, or historical records that preserved the memory of important events. They sit in museum cases today like beautiful puzzles waiting for solutions, still keeping their secrets after 4,000 years, still waiting for the key that will unlock their meaning and allow them to speak again to human minds capable of understanding their message. Each one represents hours of careful work by scribes, whose names we don't know, but whose dedication preserving knowledge speaks across the centuries of their understanding that some thoughts are too precious to trust to memory alone. Each linear A symbol seems to have its own distinctive personality when you study them closely. There's one that looks like a double-headed axe, connecting the written language to the sacred labyrinths that appeared throughout Minoan religious art. Another resembles a tree, or perhaps a flower in bloom, suggesting connections between their script and the natural world that figured so prominently in their spiritual vision. Some symbols are abstract enough to be pure geometric art, while others seem almost pictographic, hinting at the objects or ideas they might have originally represented before evolving into more stylized forms. The way these symbols combine and flow together across the clay suggests a sophisticated grammar capable of expressing complex thoughts and subtle emotions. This wasn't a primitive writing system limited to simple record keeping, but something refined over generations of use, polished by countless scribes into an instrument of remarkable flexibility and grace that could handle any communicative task their advanced civilization required. When modern scholars try to read Linear A aloud, using their best guesses about how the symbols might have sounded, the resulting speech has a musical quality that seems appropriate for people who found beauty in every aspect of life. The syllables flow together like a gentle song, consonants and vowels creating rhythms pleasant to the ear, patterns that suggest a language designed to be spoken, as well as written, sounds that would have filled palace halls with the music of human communication. Even in our imperfect understanding, we can hear echoes of a language that valued beauty in all its forms, including the beauty of speech itself. The way words could be arranged to create meanings that went beyond their simple informational content to touch deeper levels of human consciousness, to connect speakers not just to immediate practical concerns, but to the larger patterns of meaning that made life worth living. In archive rooms throughout Minoan palaces, Linear A tablets were stored on wooden shelves that have long since crumbled to dust, leaving only archaeological shadows that hint at the organizational systems that once made this vast store of written knowledge accessible to those who needed it. These were the libraries of their age, repositories of accumulated wisdom that covered every aspect of their civilization: legal codes and customary practices, religious beliefs and ceremonial procedures, historical narratives and literary creations, technical knowledge and artistic traditions. Most of these archives are lost to us forever, victims of time and the perishable materials on which they were written. Wood and papyrus have vanished, taking with them perhaps thousands of documents that would have answered our questions about Minoan life and thought. We're left with only the clay tablets, humble, practical documents that survived because they were literally baked by the fires that destroyed the palaces that housed them. Imagine what we might learn if we could read just one complete Linear A text, a Minoan poem about dolphins playing in morning light, their verses capturing the joy of creatures perfectly adapted to their element, a religious hymn to their earth goddess, its words conveying the reverence that infused their spiritual practice, a love letter between merchants separated by the demands of long-distance trade, its phrases revealing the emotional lives of individuals whose names are lost, but whose feelings would speak to us across 4 millennia. A child's school exercise, carefully copied onto clay, preserving not just information, but the process by which knowledge passed from generation to generation. Any of these would open windows into their hearts and minds that remain closed to us, would reveal aspects of human experience that might be universal enough to create genuine connection across the vast gulf of time and cultural difference that separates us from them. But the tablets remain silent, beautiful in their mystery, but frustrating in their refusal to speak in voices we can understand. Though we cannot read their words, we can understand their numbers, and these speak to us across the centuries with perfect clarity, revealing a civilization of remarkable mathematical sophistication. The linear A numerical system shows us records of vast quantities of grain that speak of abundant harvests carefully stored against future need, olive oil measured in amounts that suggest industrial-scale production, wine inventoried in quantities that indicate either extensive trade or impressive consumption, possibly both. We can trace their mathematical thinking through these numerical records, see how they calculated ratios for mixing different grades of oil, how they measured land with precision that suggests sophisticated surveying techniques, how they tracked seasonal changes and managed the complex logistics of their trading empire with numerical accuracy that rivals modern bookkeeping methods. These records tell stories of prosperity and careful planning that complement what we learn from their art and architecture, evidence of minds as sharp and precise as our own, dealing with problems not so different from those we face today. In their numbers, we find evidence of a society that could manage resources across decades, coordinate the activities of thousands of people working together in harmony, and plan for the future with confidence, based on an understanding of past patterns and present capabilities. Even without words, these numerical records whisper of success and abundance, of a civilization that had solved many of the basic problems that plague human societies. How to produce enough food, how to store wealth against uncertain times, how to coordinate complex activities across large populations, how to maintain prosperity over generations without depleting the resources that made that prosperity possible. Perhaps it's fitting that Minya A remains largely unread, its secrets preserved like treasures in some inaccessible vault that guards its contents from casual intrusion. Some mysteries are more powerful when they keep their secrets, more meaningful when they resist our attempts to reduce them to complete understanding. The undeciphered script reminds us that past civilizations had their own inner lives, their own ways of understanding reality that we may never fully grasp, their own wisdom that might be too subtle or too different from our mental categories to survive translation into modern languages. Yet in the beauty of the symbols themselves, in the care with which they were formed, in the very existence of this sophisticated writing system, we can read something essential about the Minoans that transcends the barrier of linguistic incomprehension. We can see their reverence for knowledge, their commitment to preserving wisdom beyond the limits of individual memory, and their belief that some thoughts were too precious to trust to the fragility of spoken tradition alone. Their script becomes a form of art in itself, a visual poetry that speaks to us through form and rhythm, even when its content remains mysterious. In watching these graceful symbols flow across clay surfaces, we participate in their understanding that knowledge and beauty were not separate categories, but aspects of a single truth, that the preservation of information was also an act of aesthetic creation, that writing itself could be a form of worship when practiced with sufficient reverence and skill. But even as these careful scribes preserved their knowledge in clay tablets that seemed destined for immortality, even as their artists painted frescoes that captured eternal moments of beauty, even as their architects planned buildings designed to last for centuries, forces beyond their control were already gathering like storm clouds on the horizons of their peaceful world. Natural catastrophes and cultural changes that would challenge the very foundations of the paradise they had created on their island home. The end of Minoan civilization wasn't a sudden crash that destroyed everything in a single catastrophic moment, but something more like the gradual fading of a beautiful song, a slow diminishment that happened so incrementally that each generation might have noticed only small changes, while the larger pattern remained invisible until it was too late to reverse. Around 1450 BC, something began to change in the peaceful world they had created with such care and maintained with such skill for over 1,000 years. The great palaces that had hummed with life for centuries grew quieter, their corridors echoing with fewer footsteps, their workshops producing less of the beautiful pottery, and delicate jewelry that had made Minoan craftsmanship famous across the Mediterranean world. Trade networks that had connected distant shores like arteries carrying lifeblood began to weaken. Relationships that had taken generations to build, slowly fraying as new pressures made the old cooperative arrangements more difficult to maintain. The vibrant frescoes seemed to fall silent in some indefinable way, their dolphins frozen mid-leap in painted seas that no longer seemed to pulse with the same vital energy. Their gardens preserved in colours that remained brilliant, but somehow felt like memories of abundance, rather than celebrations of continuing prosperity. What happened to these remarkable people, who had created something so beautiful that we still marvel at their achievements 4,000 years later? Scholars have proposed many theories over the decades, each as intriguing as the civilization itself. Each attempt to solve the puzzle, revealing new complexities that make simple explanations seem inadequate to account for the gradual disappearance of a culture so advanced and sophisticated. Like archaeologists working with fragments of broken pottery, we must piece together clues from incomplete evidence, creating possibilities rather than certainties, gentle theories rather than harsh conclusions that would do justice to a people who seem to have approached even their own ending with the same grace that characterized their entire approach to life. The mystery of the Minoans' disappearance invites us into a meditation on the fragility of all human achievements, the way even the most beautiful civilizations can slip away like morning mist when conditions change beyond their ability to adapt. About 70 miles north of Crete lies the island of Thera, known today as Santorini, whose crescent shape and dramatic cliffs make it one of the most photographed destinations in the modern Mediterranean. But around 1600 BC, this peaceful island was shattered by one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in recorded human history. An explosion so immense that it created the distinctive bay that gives modern Santorini's breathtaking beauty, so violent that its effects were felt across the entire eastern Mediterranean. Imagine the moment when Minoan lookouts, perhaps standing on the north-facing terraces of Knossos, first saw the distant column of ash rising from the northern horizon like a pillar connecting earth to sky, darker than any storm cloud, growing larger and more ominous with each passing hour. The initial eruption would have been visible from Crete as a distant spectacle, beautiful perhaps in its terrible power, before its consequences became clear. The explosion sent tsunamis racing across the Aegean Sea, waves that could have reached Crete's northern shores in less than an hour, carrying the destructive power of the eruption directly to the heart of Minoan civilization. Coastal settlements would have been swept away. Harbours that had sheltered peaceful merchant ships for generations suddenly transformed into scenes of devastating chaos that no amount of engineering skill or architectural planning could have prevented. But the immediate devastation, terrible as it must have been, may have been less significant than the long-term effects that followed in the months and years after the eruption. The volcanic ash drifted across the region like grey snow, settling on fields and vineyards that had fed the Minoan people for centuries, coating olive groves with layers of debris that blocked sunlight and poisoned soil that had been fertile beyond measure. The fine particles would have remained suspended in the atmosphere for months, perhaps years, dimming the sun and cooling the climate in ways that disrupted the agricultural cycles that supported Minoan prosperity. Crops would have failed, not just for a single season, but potentially for several years in succession, creating food shortages that would have strained the resources of even the wealthiest society, forcing difficult choices between maintaining trade relationships and feeding local populations. This wasn't a single catastrophic blow that destroyed everything at once, but a slow weakening that worked like a tree whose roots have been damaged. Still standing, still beautiful to look at, but no longer able to draw the nourishment it needed to thrive, slowly declining as its stored energy was exhausted without being replenished. The Minoans, with their sophisticated understanding of natural cycles and their deep connection to the land that sustained them, would have understood the implications better than most people of their time, and would have seen the long-term consequences even as they worked to adapt to immediate challenges. Crete sits in one of the world's most seismically active regions, where tectonic plates meet and shift with patient but inexorable force that makes earthquakes a regular part of life. A natural hazard that the Minoans had learned to live with through architectural innovations and cultural adaptations that showed a remarkable understanding of geological processes. Their palace architecture shows clear evidence of earthquake-resistant design. Flexible joints that could absorb ground movement, reinforced walls that could withstand shaking, and sophisticated drainage systems that could continue to function even when buildings shifted on their foundations. But around the time of Minoan decline, seismic activity may have intensified beyond their ability to cope, creating a drumbeat of destruction that grew harder to recover from with each repetition. Palace complexes show signs of repeated rebuilding, walls patched and repatched with materials that suggest emergency repairs rather than planned renovations. Elegant columns replaced with cruder substitutes that speak of resources stretched thin by constant reconstruction needs. Each earthquake would have required enormous investments of labor and materials to repair, energy that might otherwise have gone into the arts and trade that made their civilization flourish. The psychological toll would have been significant as well, living with constant uncertainty about when the next tremor might strike, whether the careful work of rebuilding would be destroyed again before it could be completed, and whether the stable foundation of their world could continue to support the elaborate superstructure of culture they had built upon it. The Minoans were remarkably resilient, adapting to each challenge with characteristic grace and ingenuity, but perhaps there comes a point where even the most adaptable society grows weary of constant reconstruction, where the effort required to maintain basic infrastructure begins to overshadow the creative energies that had made their culture distinctive, where survival starts to take precedence over the cultivation of beauty that had been their greatest achievement. Picture the palace workshops falling silent, not from a single devastating quake, but from the cumulative exhaustion of a people who had spent generations rebuilding, but the restless earth kept shaking apart, their energy gradually diverted from creation to restoration, until the distinctive Minoan combination of artistry and prosperity became harder to maintain, their society slowly losing the characteristics that had made it unique in the ancient world. Yet mysteries remain, woven through the ruins of their palaces like golden threads through ancient tapestries, embedded in the fragments of their art, like secrets waiting to be discovered by eyes capable of seeing what previous generations have missed. In the patterns of their daily lives and the grand designs of their architecture, questions linger that may never be fully answered, puzzles that continue to intrigue archaeologists and dreamers alike, riddles that remind us how much we still don't understand about this remarkable civilization that vanished so completely from history. Even after more than a century of careful excavation, patient analysis, and brilliant detective work by scholars from around the world, the Minoans continue to guard their deepest secrets, like ancient priests, protecting sacred mysteries from casual intrusion. Each archaeological season brings new discoveries that expand our knowledge while somehow deepening the essential mystery. Each answer revealing 3 new questions, each solved puzzle exposing larger patterns that remain tantalizingly unclear. It's as if this remarkable civilization left us a collection of beautiful riddles, intellectual and spiritual challenges wrapped in art and buried in the gentle earth of Crete, waiting for minds capable of understanding not just their surface meanings, but their deeper implications for how human societies might organize themselves, how beauty might function in practical life, how peace might be maintained without the constant threat of violence that characterized most ancient civilizations. Visitors often report feeling they're seeing only the surface of something much deeper and more complex, like looking at the moon's reflection in still water, beautiful and clear in its own way, yet somehow not quite the thing itself. A representation that captures some essential qualities while missing others that might be even more important to understanding what Minoan civilization really achieved. The mysteries that remain unsolved aren't failures of archaeological method or scholarly analysis, but invitations to wonder, gaps in our knowledge that keep the Minoans eternally fascinating. Questions that challenge our assumptions about how ancient societies must have functioned. Puzzles that suggest there might be ways of organizing human life that we haven't yet learned to recognize or understand. Perhaps some of these riddles are meant to remain unsolved, their mystery more precious than any definitive answer could ever be. One of the most intriguing mysteries surrounds what isn't there in Minoan archaeology. The complete absence of fortifications around their palaces and cities, the remarkable lack of defensive structures that would have been considered absolutely essential by every other Bronze Age civilization we know about. In an ancient world where every other society built walls and towers and defensive installations as a matter of basic survival, the Minoans seem to have lived in remarkable openness. Their settlements spread comfortably across hillsides, with no apparent thought of military defense. Their palaces sprawl gracefully across the landscape like peaceful cities designed for comfort and beauty rather than security. Their storage areas filled with precious goods sit exposed and accessible rather than hidden behind protective barriers. Their harbours show no evidence of defensive booms or fortified installations that would have protected their merchant ships from hostile attack. It's as if they lived in a world without enemies, or perhaps had discovered some secret of diplomacy and cultural influence that made enemies unnecessary. How did they achieve this remarkable state of security without the military preparations that other cultures considered indispensable? Did they possess a navy so powerful and well-organized that no potential enemy dared to attack their island home? Were they protected by natural barriers that made invasion so unlikely that defensive preparations seemed unnecessary? Or did they truly achieve something almost miraculous? A civilization so peaceful in its own nature, so beneficial to its neighbors, that warfare became obsolete within their sphere of influence. The mystery deepens when we consider that the Minoans weren't naive about conflict or ignorant of military affairs. They knew of wars in Egypt and Mesopotamia, traded with militaristic societies, maintained relationships with people who solved their disputes through violence, yet somehow managed to maintain their own peaceful character despite this exposure to more aggressive cultures. How they managed this choice for over 1,000 years remains one of history's most beautiful puzzles. In museum cases around the world, small figurines of the snake goddess gaze out with serene expressions that seem to hold secrets we can barely imagine. Serpents coiled around their arms like living jewelry that speaks of mysteries we're only beginning to approach. These sculptures are among the most iconic artifacts of Minoan civilization, yet we understand almost nothing about what they truly represented, what beliefs they embodied, what role they played in the spiritual life of their creators. Were these goddesses, in the sense we understand, divine figures, immortal beings worshipped from a distance, recipients of prayers and offerings? Were they priestesses captured in ceramic form? Human women elevated to sacred status through their religious roles? Or were they perhaps symbolic representations of natural forces, abstract concepts given human form to make them more accessible to worshippers who needed concrete images to focus their devotion? Serpents themselves suggest themes of renewal and transformation, creatures that shed their skins and emerge reborn, symbols of the cycles of death and regeneration that governed all natural processes. But the specific beliefs these figurines embodied remain as mysterious as the gentle smiles on their ceramic faces, their meanings locked away in a religious tradition that left no written explanations we can read. Recent discoveries have revealed similar figures in sacred caves high in the Cretan mountains, suggesting a widespread belief system that connected palace-dwelling elite with rural populations. Yet without written records we can decipher, these beautiful artifacts keep their secrets, inviting us to imagine, rather than know, the spiritual world they represent. Perhaps the mystery itself is appropriate. The deeper spiritual truths have always been guarded carefully, preserved through symbol and ritual, rather than explanation. Greek mythology tells us that deep beneath the palace of Knossos lay the labyrinth, a maze so complex that no one who entered could ever find their way out without guidance. A prison designed to contain the Minotaur until the hero Theseus arrived to end the monster's reign. Arthur Evans, believed he had found the inspiration for this myth in the palace's complex floor plan, corridors that curved and branched, storerooms that connected in seemingly random patterns. But modern archaeologists are less certain. The palace's complexity might simply reflect sophisticated urban planning, efficient storage systems, and natural growth patterns that emerged as buildings were expanded over centuries. Perhaps the labyrinth exists only in myth, a later Greek attempt to understand ruins they couldn't fully comprehend. Yet visitors to Knossos today often report experiencing something that feels remarkably like the mythological labyrinth, a strange sensation of being gently lost, despite clear pathways, of corridors that seem familiar yet lead to unexpected destinations. Perhaps the labyrinth isn't a physical structure, but something more subtle, a state of consciousness induced by the palace's unique design, a way of experiencing space that reflects Minoan understanding of how architecture might affect human psychology and spiritual awareness. Maybe the true labyrinth was never meant to confuse or imprison, but to transform, a sacred space designed to induce meditative wandering that leads not to physical destinations but to inner discoveries, passages that guided visitors through psychological territories as much as architectural ones. The mystery remains unsolved because it may require imagination as much as analysis, the kind of understanding that comes through experience rather than explanation. Thousands of linear tablets continue to wait in archaeological storerooms around the world, their symbols as graceful as ever, their meaning as elusive as morning mist. Despite decades of intensive effort by brilliant linguists and cryptographers, the Minoan language remains largely unread, a beautiful script that guards its secrets with patient silence. What makes this particularly mysterious is that we can read Linear B, the script that succeeded Linear A, but Linear A appears to represent something entirely different, perhaps a language unrelated to any known language family, a unique linguistic creation that died with its speakers. Some scholars believe they've identified a few recurring words. Others see patterns that suggest poetry or sacred formulas. But these are glimpses at best, fragments that tantalize without satisfying. The undeciphered tablets continue to accumulate with each excavation, each new find bringing hope that perhaps this discovery will contain the key that finally unlocks their meaning. Until that breakthrough comes, these clay documents remain beautiful mysteries, letters from the past written in an unknown tongue that speaks to us through graceful symbols while withholding the actual content of its message. Perhaps the greatest archaeological mystery is how Minoan civilization managed to exist at all in the context of Bronze Age history. They represent something that seems almost impossible, a complex, sophisticated society that apparently functioned without the warfare, oppression, and systematic violence that characterized virtually every other civilization of their time and region. Their art shows no glorification of military conquest, no depictions of enslaved enemies, no celebration of royal power maintained through fear. Their palaces were designed for beauty and comfort rather than defense. Their trade relationships appeared genuinely cooperative rather than exploitative. How did they manage this when every other ancient civilization was built on foundations of organized violence and systematic inequality? Some suggest we simply haven't found evidence of Minoan warfare yet, that their peaceful appearance reflects incomplete excavation rather than genuinely different social organization. Others propose that their peaceful nature has been romanticized by modern scholars, projecting contemporary values onto ancient evidence. What if the Minoans truly discovered something later civilizations forgot? A way of organizing society that made systematic violence unnecessary. A form of prosperity that lifted everyone, rather than benefiting only the powerful few. Perhaps they understood something about human psychology that enabled them to channel competitive impulses into creative rather than destructive outlets. Their bull leaping ceremonies might represent sophisticated methods of channeling courage and competitive spirit into community service rather than hierarchies of dominance. Their artistic traditions might have transmitted values that maintained social cohesion without authoritarian control. The possibility that they achieved something genuinely different remains one of the most intriguing questions their civilization poses. Dolphins leap through painted seas with such grace they seem ready to splash beyond their plaster ocean and continue their eternal dance in Mediterranean waters. These marine creatures appear throughout Minoan art not as decoration, but as sacred symbols carrying meanings we can only guess at. But why dolphins? What did these intelligent sea mammals represent to people who made them central to their artistic vision? Were they guides for souls journeying between worlds? Did they symbolize the free spirit that characterized their civilization? Perhaps they represented the sea itself in its most appealing form, not the terrible force that could destroy ships, but the playful element that connected different people through trade and cultural exchange. The dolphins seem to capture something essential about their creators, a joyful engagement with the world that found beauty worth celebrating in every aspect of existence. Yet their specific meanings remain elusive, beautiful mysteries that invite contemplation without yielding definitive answers. In making dolphins central to their art, the Minoans may have been acknowledging something profound about existence itself, that its deepest meanings are experienced in moments of grace rather than captured in rigid explanations. Each year brings new archaeological discoveries that deepen rather than resolve the central mysteries. We learn more about how they lived while remaining mystified by why they lived as they did, by the worldview that made their remarkable achievements possible. Modern technology reveals details invisible to earlier excavators, yet each discovery seems to expose new complexities that make simple explanations inadequate. Perhaps this is as it should be. The Minoans created something so unique, so different from what came before or after, that complete understanding may be impossible for minds shaped by different assumptions about human nature and social organization. Their mysteries serve important functions beyond intellectual curiosity. They remind us that human creativity has extended far beyond what we currently understand, that our assumptions about what's possible in human affairs may be more limited than we realize. As night settles over modern Crete, and stars begin to reflect in the same Aegean waters that once carried Minoan ships, the mysteries remain as compelling as ever. In museum cases, the snake goddess continues her patient smile, holding secrets that may never be fully revealed. In reconstructed palace halls, dolphins still leap through their eternal seas, their grace undiminished by millennia. In archaeological storerooms, linear tablets wait with the patience of ages for someone to unlock their wisdom. The Minoans left us not answers, but questions, not certainties, but wonders that continue to challenge and inspire everyone who encounters their remarkable legacy. Perhaps that is their greatest gift, the reminder that the past holds mysteries as beautiful as any art they created, as enduring as the olive trees that still grow on their island home, as infinite as the sea that connected them to the ancient world and connects them still to us. In the gentle darkness of a Cretan night, surrounded by the eternal whisper of waves and the rustle of olive leaves moved by winds that have blown across this island for millennia, it's easy to imagine that the Minoans haven't truly disappeared at all, that they exist still in every moment of beauty we pause to notice, in every choice we make for cooperation over competition, in every recognition that the most profound truths often reveal themselves not through conquest, but through wonder and reverence for the mysterious forces that sustain all life.